Hello, everyone. I'm Arben Skivjani, Deputy Chief Economist and Director of Forecasting here at RealPage, and one of the hosts of the Multifamily Talks at RealPage podcast. For today's episode, I was joined by Brad Case, the Chief Economist at Middleburg Communities, a fully integrated rental housing company. Now, during our 45-minute conversation, we talked about various aspects of the economy that continue to shape our industry, such as inflation, interest rates, employment, as well as consumer sentiment. Now, we also talked about the investment side of the industry, and Brad shared with us the most important metrics that investors should also pay attention to when evaluating multifamily properties. Now, we hope that you will enjoy the next 3/4 of an hour of our conversation. Well, part of my gig with the podcast is to scout out economists like yourself who can really dive into what's happening in the economy and how it's affecting our industry. And I've been keeping an eye on your LinkedIn posts for a while now. And of course, they are super insightful.
Glad.
When it came to picking a guest for today's episode, your name was at the top of my list, no doubt about it. So thanks a bunch for agreeing to come on and chat with us today, Brad.
Oh, I'm very happy about it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And so today we'll be diving into the juicy world of economic indicators. I think interest rate, inflation, employment, GDP, as well as consumer sentiment, and how they are shaking things up in the multifamily industry, so our industry. And it's been a roller coaster of a year, to say the least. And honestly, it feels like we're still navigating through a bit of a maze here. Plenty of uncertainties are still on the table. But hey, before we jump into all that exciting stuff, at least for us, we usually kick things off with a few personal questions just to get to know our guests a bit better. So
Great.
You've been in this industry way longer than I have, and I bet you have seen a ton over the years. and so I'd love to hear about how you got your start in economics, more specifically in real estate economics, and what journey brought you to where you are today. And if you could, just share a bit about the company you are currently with.
Yeah, sure thing. So I first got interested in real estate. This sounds geeky, but when I was in high school, and at that time I was interested in how property tax systems worked. And then when I finished college, I went to Berkeley for a master's degree and worked with a professor named John Quigley. And at that time, that was the late 80s, real estate in Hawaii, which was where I grew up, was being bought up sort of frantically by Japanese buyers because the Japanese economy was in a bubble at that time. And so they felt as though they just had all the money in the world. And they were bidding up house prices in Hawaii. And that really got me interested in real estate economics for the first time. And John Quigley was a fabulous person to be in contact with when that was my sort of initial interest. So he and I actually worked out a house price index methodology. I don't know if you've heard of the Case and Shiller index.
Absolutely.
That's not me. But the Case and Quigley index, we worked out at the same time in response to what Chip Case, who became a friend, and Bob Shiller, who became not just a friend, but my dissertation advisor, had worked out themselves. So they turned theirs into a commercial product. We didn't try to turn ours into a commercial product, but it is sort of for academic purposes a better way to estimate house prices. So that's where my interest in real estate economics started. Since then, I've worked in different parts of the real estate market. I've been in owner-occupied housing, rental housing, which is what I do now, and other property types. So right now I work for a company called Middleburg Communities. It's based just outside of Washington, D.C., and is very active as a developer, builder, manager, owner, buyer, and seller of rental housing communities. And that's both sort of traditional multifamily and single-family rental communities. But in that case, I don't mean that we own individual houses here and there the way some companies do. What I mean is we develop communities of single-family houses with the same sorts of amenities that you would have in a high-quality multifamily community, and the same sort of professional management. So it's actually very rare for a company like Middleburg to have an economist, or sometimes they'll have somebody with a title of economist, but not really the education as an economist. So for me, going back to that time at Berkeley, I got a master's degree then, and then I went on to Yale University, where I got a PhD in economics. As you said, working with Bob Schiller, and I've been doing sort of academic style research in real estate markets ever since.
Oh, that is fascinating, and I envy you. But so, every job has its ups and downs, and being a chief economist is no exception. So, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in your role, and are there any misconceptions about what you do?
Well, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is that when you are an economist who's actually trained as an economist, what you have developed is a way of thinking about economic issues, and more importantly, a way of investigating them. And so a lot of people who maybe call themselves economists but are not trained as an economist think that what that means is you talk about economic issues, but not that you have a particular way of studying them. And so one of the misconceptions is I'm not just spouting off about what I think about economic issues. I have researched them carefully, and I'm trying to deliver a message that sort of has a level of rigor, of scientific rigor in it, that is not present in just sort of casual conversation about economic topics. So I would say that's the biggest challenge is sort of telling people, look, when I say I'm an economist, I'm not just spouting off. I am going to say something because I've looked at it carefully using the set of tools that economists develop in PhD programs.
So are you telling me you don't use Chat GPT to come up with solutions to the problems?
Not yet. Maybe it'll come to that. And I hate saying something like that because it sounds arrogant, but it is a different way of thinking about things and a different set of tools that we use really to test ideas before we say them.
Absolutely. And I got a master's in economics, not PhD. And nowadays, being an economist means only knowing how to use R, eViews, and that's it, right? So it's, pretty much a coder, not an economist. But that's sort of a different topic. So no matter how long we've been, grinding in our fields, and there's always something that gets us out of bed in the morning and ready to sort of crush it, right? So as an economist, I'm sure you've got that fire too, right? So what's the spark that keeps you going every day? So what's the big motivator in your work life?
Oh, it's the new ideas. Often it's while I'm taking a shower in the morning that a new idea comes to me, and I'll go downstairs kind of thoughtful. And when I'm having breakfast with my wife, she'll ask what I'm thinking about, and I'll say I had a good idea this morning. And so I just sort of can't wait to get to the office and try to code it. I use Python instead of R nowadays, but try to code it, try to test it, try to see whether it's really true with high quality data to support it. That's what really makes me excited as an economist, and especially in my current job.
I'm glad to hear that, and I definitely agree. I mean, it's a really good science, at least for those of us who love it, and we as economists and our theories have really changed the game in so many ways. So maybe it's that invisible hand that nudges us towards the field, right? But let's flip the script just a bit. If you weren't rocking it as an economist, more specifically as a real estate economist, what's another career path you could see yourself jamming on?
Well, before I decided to shoot toward becoming an economist, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And I think I probably would have been a good lawyer and enjoyed that. However, what really would make me excited, I think, would be to be a minister. And maybe that sounds entirely different, but I really like thinking about the kinds of issues that come up when religion is very important to you. That's not going to happen. I'm very happy as an economist, but that's another career path that I might have chosen.
Excellent. Well, before we dive deep into the heart of our podcast, of the series, I want to address a common stereotype, right? Economics is often labeled as the dismal science, right? We are dismal scientists, and partly because it's believed that we economists think that the best days are not in front of us, but behind us, and that we lack a sense of humor, right? So could you please help me bust this myth right here and right now? And can you share a quick joke about economists to lighten up the mood, okay, and show a different side? And I can start by sharing one, okay?
So, let's hear it.
All right. So why did the economists break up with their significant other?
Why? Why?
Because they were tired of being the only one trying to find the equilibrium in the relationship. How about that?
I would say keep your day job. Well, I'll tell you my favorite economic joke, and it's not one I made up, but can I tell it to you?
Absolutely.
So it said that the first rule of economics is, for every economist, there's an equal and opposite economist. And the second rule is they're both wrong.
That's a good one. See,
I'll tell you, you mentioned that economists sometimes make it sound like our best days are behind us, and I actually think just the opposite. In fact, my brother is in politics. He's in Congress, and sometimes he sort of gets the idea, often from his constituents, I think, that it used to be so much better in the good old days. And I tell him, and I think this is really true, almost every day in almost every part of the world, things are getting better. But usually it's not by enough for us to really be aware of it. We just sort of have to keep in mind there's almost not a single day and almost not any place in the world where things are not getting better every day.
Absolutely. We have just to keep trying and doing what we are doing.
Yeah.
Every day we'll hopefully we'll get better.
Yeah.
Now, setting the jokes aside, let's delve into some burning issues. Okay, so we've been living in extraordinary times where what was once unusual has sort of become commonplace. Now, typically a surge in employment, right, in job creation means that the economy is doing well. Everybody, is happy. But nowadays, even a figure close to, let's say, 100,000 jobs sparks fear of provoking the mighty Fed, right, into further rate hikes. On the flip side, we've seen a nearly 5% growth in GDP in the third quarter, which, in my opinion, is quite impressive. Right? It's pretty good. Consumer spending is holding strong, yet there's a pervasive sense of unease about the economy. Now, many economists have been hinting at a recession since last year, I would say. And as the saying goes, if you predict something long enough, it might just come true. It might just happen. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Are we on the cusp of a recession in the near term, or have we sort of already weathered the worst of it?
We're not on the cusp of a recession. In fact, I have been saying for almost 2 years that that there are no data suggesting that we're on our way into a recession. And I keep on telling the people I work with, as soon as the data start to suggest we're going into a recession, I will let you know. But the data are simply not there. And when we look at something like a strong jobs report, and we hear, oh, that's terrible. We're hearing that from a very limited set of people. and it's people who don't want higher interest rates for one of two reasons. Number one, their investments will do better if interest rates stay down, which means we're talking about very wealthy people, because they're the ones who have the investments that are interest rate sensitive. Or the other set of people who are unhappy about rising interest rates are the people who have borrowed a lot or need to borrow a lot. And again, that's a very limited set of people. Those are the people that we hear about, especially when we're looking at financial news on television or radio or something like that. But for most people, we just have to remember that a strong job market is a good thing, and not listen to the small number of people for whom, who treat it as a bad thing because they don't want interest rates to go up. When you look at GDP can often be misleading. And so that 5% plus GDP that we had last quarter was an example of a misleading one. Also, in the first two quarters of 2021, there was a lot of discussion that maybe we were already in a recession because there were 2 quarters of negative real GDP growth. And again, GDP was misleading in both of those 2 quarters. One quarter, it was because of big changes in inventories, which have a big effect on GDP, but don't really affect people's lives. And the other, it was a big change in net imports. Again, something that has a big effect on GDP, but not on people's lives. When you really want to know, are we in a recession? It's not about negative growth in GDP, because GDP can be thrown off. It's about, is there weakness, nationwide weakness, and significant weakness in job markets, in income growth, in consumption growth, and to a certain extent in business investment growth. We simply haven't had those. We've had a month here and a month there where one of those might be weak, but we're not anywhere like a recessionary sort of economy. And we're not yet showing signs of moving toward one. So I think we have to be really careful and say, not, is there some indicator that I can point to that says things are weak? You're always going to be able to find something. But the real question is, for most people in this country, is this a pretty good economy? And the answer is yes, it is.
Of course, can always get better, be better, but it can always be, worse, much worse than it is now. So let's rewind to the start of 2021. So almost 3 years ago. Now, inflation was at a modest 1.4%, 1.5%. But then by December, same year, it skyrocketed to 7%. So 5.5 percentage point increase in a matter of 11 months, 10 months. Now, despite this, the Fed kept labeling it transitory, right? And expecting a return to normalcy, which in hindsight seems like a misstep. Now, they only started to act, I believe it was March 2022, when inflation hit 8.5%. And they hiked interest rates by only 25 basis points. Now, fast forward to June, and the inflation rate peaked at 9.1%. Now, since then, the Fed has increased funds rate, I believe, by 8 more times, and now at 5.25%, 5.5% range, while inflation has cooled down to 3.2%. So a little bit more than 3%, but less than 3.5%. So we're still not at 2% target, a target set by the Fed for no reason, but the decline is, I would say, noticeable. So here's my question to you. Do you think the Fed might repeat its early mistake in exiting this high inflation cycle? So specifically, might they maintain the current Fed funds rate longer than necessary, just as they were slow to respond when inflation began rising back in 2021?
Yeah, so let me answer that question very, very quickly and then at more length. I don't think it's likely that they'll make a significant mistake in terms of when they start reducing interest rates. However, I also don't think they made a mistake at the beginning. I think they got a bad rap. When they said that inflation was transitory, I think they were correct, because the initial bump up in inflation came as a result of tangled supply chains worldwide, and that was mostly because of COVID, and then also because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if and when they said transitory, a lot of people interpreted that as saying it'll be quickly over. That's not what they meant by transitory. What they meant was the supply chains will untangle and inflation will go away without our having to address things with interest rates. And at that time, I think that was exactly the situation. It was, in fact, transitory, but that didn't mean it was going to go away quickly. What happened then, though, was that people continued buying very strongly, even though prices had gone up. And that's what caused inflation to be something that they really had to fight against. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that when COVID hit, the ways that the government has of collecting data simply didn't work at the way they usually do. And so they've had to be careful not to overreact to what might turn out to be faulty data on, for example, consumption and income growth. And it's the same thing now. So the general market perception is that the Fed has finished raising interest rates and will start cutting them sometime next year. And I think that's probably fairly likely. But economic conditions are still so strong that they may actually have to raise interest rates one more time, because they have, in fact, conquered inflation. But what they haven't conquered is the risk that inflation could flare up again. And when I say they conquered inflation, we haven't seen inflation down to 2% yet, but the Fed understands that it will go back down to 2% because what's keeping it up now is the leases that people signed on apartments a year ago, and more than a year ago. Those leases are gone. There is no current inflation in apartment rents, but the way the CPI is computed, it still shows up. The Fed understands that, so they're not waiting for the inflation rate to get back down to 2%. They know that the inflation has gone away. What they're looking for is balance in the labor markets, balance in overall demand. They're looking for assurances that people don't expect inflation to remain high. Those three things are the sorts of things that can cause inflation to flare up again, and that's what they're fighting against now.
So while we are on the subject of inflation and its effects on the economy, I'd like to throw in another question related to that. Mm-hmm. So mortgage rates hit 8% in October, and since then they have sort of come down, but they're nowhere near what we had become accustomed to in recent recent years. So how has the multifamily lending landscape shifted in the past few months, few quarters with these climbing rates? I mean, do you believe there is sufficient capital available in the markets?
So yes, I do. I am not a fan of zero interest rates or very low interest rates generally, because what happens when interest rates are that low is that any idiot can, make an investment in real estate because the interest rate is so low. It's like having free debt, free money to play with. What I want is a situation where interest rates are not especially high, but high enough to get rid of the idiots. And I think that's what we are accomplishing now. There are a lot of development projects that have fallen by the wayside for one of two reasons. Number one, they made sense only because debt was essentially free. And once you brought interest rates up, both for construction and for borrowing a mortgage to buy a property, then for some of those people, the project they had in mind no longer made economic sense. And that's a good thing. We don't want to be building everything that makes sense only when interest rates are so low. But the other reason that some projects have fallen by the wayside is that the developers simply don't have the experience, don't have the track record to get through the process of not just financing a project, but actually building it when when there are some barriers in the way. And again, you don't want a market where every idiot is active in the market. You want a market where the people who are left are the people with the financial wherewithal, the experience, the track record, to continue to make their projects work.
Absolutely. So let's switch gears to the supply side of things, right? So we have seen hundreds of thousands of new apartment units pop up over the past year and even the past 2 years. And our latest figures show about 1 million more under construction. That's just incredible. So what sort of challenges is the multifamily industry grappling with in terms of new construction and new development?
Yeah, well, I think you have to keep in mind that the new construction is not geographically evenly dispersed. There are certain markets that have gotten a lot of new supply, and that's because there's a combination of those, less experienced developers saying, I don't know how to build properties sort of everywhere there's demand. But hey, I can get something done in Austin, Texas, and it's the same thing with the financiers. When those inexperienced developers go looking for investors to help provide the capital, and interest rates were very low, and they're saying, look, this project works great. The investors will say, hey, Austin, Texas, I know things are going gangbusters there. So all sorts of projects get financed in certain locations. But if you look at other locations, the demand growth is simply stronger than a lot of people appreciate. And some of those are even the big markets that attract a lot of attention. A place like Orlando or Tampa in Florida, for example. Those will get the attention of both the developers and the investors. But I think that a lot of people underestimate the strength of demand growth going forward. But then on top of that, there are lots of secondary markets where investors say, hey, I'm happy with Austin, Texas, but I'm not happy with Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It's too small a market for me to be comfortable investing in. And so it's more difficult to get projects done in a place like Myrtle Beach, or even smaller markets. Winchester, Virginia, which is not too far from where I am, or Harrisonburg, which is farther, but still in my state of Virginia. These are secondary and tertiary markets where you haven't had the oversupply that you have in certain markets, and where you still have demand growth. So there are a lot of places in this country where you simply don't have the demand growth. And a lot of those are the older cities where people are moving away from, San Francisco, New York, Boston. But in other places, it's not that the demand growth is very weak. It's just that it's been fully accounted for by supply growth, and you just have to have a good enough way of evaluating markets to say, yeah, that's not the case in a Tampa or in Orlando. Demand growth is stronger there than most people have realized.
Now, let's briefly talk about another segment of housing. BTRs. So over the past year or over the past couple of years, build to rent or BTR units have skyrocketed in popularity and turning into a multi-billion-dollar industry. So how has this surge in single-family rentals affected the apartment market? I mean, do you think this is a trend that's will keep growing?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's very important to understand that a lot of what is happening in the build to rent is that until not very long ago, if you wanted 4 walls, you had to get a scattered site rent house that had been built to be lived in by an owner, but instead was being managed by, the guy who owned it, who lived a block or two away, who really didn't know much about managing a rental property. And so you had, sort of amateur property management, which means that when the toilet overflows in the middle of the night, you're not necessarily going to get it fixed until the manager wakes up in the morning, the owner wakes up in the morning, hires a plumber to go visit it, to figure it out. The plumber goes back to the warehouse to get the parts needed. So before, if you wanted four walls, you had to buy them. Now we have these purpose-built, built-to-rent communities with that professional management. And there are a lot of people who became homeowners who would have preferred to remain renters, but they wanted the four walls, and they wanted and in order to get the four walls, they had to buy it. Now, what effect has it had on apartments? You have to think differently when you're building a single-family community than when you're building a multifamily community. But you also have to think differently than if you're used to building single-family houses for sale. And I think a lot of the houses that have been built that are offered for rent are houses that were actually designed for owners. And renters want something different. And so I think there's a lot of shakeout to be done in this industry. First of all, as people understand that they don't like the idea of amateur property management on a scattered site rental. They also don't like renting a house that was built to be owned. I'll give you an example. Sure. If you are building a house that's intended for sale, you may have a 1-year warranty on everything. That means you're going to put in those fittings that will last at least 1 year. If you're building something that is intended for rent, you want those fittings to last for much more than 1 year, because you're the one who's going to own the property 10 years into the future. You're the one who's going to be maintaining it and repairing it. So it may be surprising for people to hear this, but generally speaking, the construction quality of houses built to rent is higher than the construction quality of new houses built, originally intended for sale, but instead rented out. So I think there's a lot of runway. And if you look at the longer history of real estate investment, the best returns on a risk-adjusted basis over a long period have been in apartments. Sort of rental housing as it's been available since the 1970s for institutional investors to invest in. That's where we have the data for. But if you look at the other best performing property types, they're not the property types that institutions have been investing in forever, like office and retail and even industrial or warehouse. They are the newer property types, things like cell towers. And so build to rent is another of the newer property types. So what happens when there's a newer property type is the most competent people get in there quickly and start inventing that property type, and the returns tend to be quite strong until you end up in a situation where the people who don't really understand how to do it very well finally get into that market.
Absolutely. Any particular market that you're watching when it comes to BDR?
Well, we're focused on the southeastern part of the country. So basically, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and even Texas. So some of the markets that we're looking for the build to rent are the same as the ones that we're looking for multifamily. But there is a little bit of a difference, because when we're looking to develop multifamily properties, we don't develop our properties with an elderly population or a retired population in mind, or with a student population in mind. It's the same thing with our single family rental. And for the multifamily, that means we're looking at growth in the population of employed people in their 20s and early 30s. For the single family, the build to rent group, it's a little bit of an older group, because it tends to be people who have already been in a multifamily place. Now they're ready for the four walls, and it may be because they have children, or simply because they got married, or they finally got a pet, and they want those four walls. They want their own lawn out in front, but they don't want to buy it. What they want is that professional management with the amenities that come in that build-to-rent community. So to a great extent, it's the same as the analysis that we do for multifamily. We're looking for job growth. We're looking for growth in the young adult population, but it is a little bit of a different young adult population that we're looking at.
So let's get back to multifamily industry. So it's no secret that things like jobs, employment in general, and how many folks are moving into an area really push our industry forward. And I mean, when it comes down to it, it's all about the people who are going to rent those apartments. So from what you have been seeing lately, which groups of people are really driving the demand in the multifamily market these days?
Oh, it's all about household formation, and I think that a lot of people don't really understand how important household formation is in general and how important it is right now. Household formation simply means instead of living with my parents, instead of living with my fraternity brothers or my sorority sisters, I'm going to sign my own lease. And the household formation rate is far below now where it was 23 years ago. What happened was the federal government really tried to push homeownership onto people who didn't really want it and didn't really have the financial security to take on the risks of homeownership. That a lot of those people went ahead and bought the house with the variable rate mortgage because they were being encouraged to by the government and of course by mortgage brokers and real estate brokers, and they got burned really badly. A lot of people don't understand how much money was lost specifically by young people and by people who didn't have that much money to begin with. The mortgage market crisis of 2007 to 2009 really didn't affect people who had a lot of money and were in their 40s and 50s. It really affected young people and people who didn't have a lot of money. So they're the ones who moved it back in with their parents, moved back in with their friends, and now that their financial situation is a little bit more secure, they're ready to go out on their own and sign their lease. And so that household formation is what's really driving demand growth in rental housing generally, not just multifamily, but also single family rental, build to rent communities.
Just quickly, where are we at in terms of the market cycle for multifamily real estate? I mean, what is your outlook for, let's say, next 2-3 years? And what I'm really asking is, what is your secret sauce when it comes to forecasting like for 2-3 years now?
So we forecast 3 to 5 years out because that's how long it takes to first find a piece of property, vet it as a possible site for building either a multifamily community or a build to rent single family community. Get all the permitting done, start the construction, finish the construction, and start leasing the spaces. So when I look at the 3 to 5 year picture ahead, in our part of the country, the migration is very strong. And it used to be that the migration to the Southeast was driven by retirees. That's no longer the case. I mean, there are still retirees moving to the Southeast. But what is happening more recently is that employers are moving to the Southeast. And they're doing that partly because they know they'll be able to find good employees. And partly because the living conditions, the sort of urban amenities, are good enough that their existing employees are happy to move with the company. So we're seeing a lot of employment growth in the Southeast, and that's true in a place like Austin or Charlotte or Nashville, but it's also true in a lot of other cities that maybe aren't on people's radar as sort of destinations for employers to move to, places like Orlando. Places like San Antonio. So there's a lot of employment growth happening in the Southeast, and we do forecast employment growth in the 3 to 5 year, 3 to 5 years out. And because of that, there are a lot of younger professionals who are moving there. And for the kinds of properties that my company develops, we call them middle market class A. They are good quality properties. They are not luxury properties. They're not waterfront. They're not towers. They're not, they're not the kind of place that wealthy people move to. They're the kind of places that people with good jobs move to. And so we're not looking to follow, the super rich to places like Miami. We're looking to follow, the middle market employees to the places like Charlotte or Tampa. But the other thing, so we look at migration, we look at employment growth, we look at the changes in the tendency to rent rather than to own, and as I said, we look at household formation. So those are really the key variables that we pay attention to when we're evaluating demand growth in an area. And then, of course, we also forecast supply growth, and that's how we're able to identify, a place like an Orlando or a Tampa where, there's supply growth, but it's not enough to meet the demand growth, versus a place like Austin where, there's plenty of demand growth, but the supply growth is more than enough to keep up with it.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that with us. Now, let's touch on a topic that's, let's say, stirring up quite a bit of debate. During the pandemic, like others in many industries, we shifted to remote work, and honestly, it's been working, out pretty well for us. I mean, I haven't heard any employee on our side complain about it or management. However, lately we're seeing many companies across various sectors asking their employees to return to office, and this move hasn't been exactly embraced by everyone. So I'm curious about your perspective. How has this shift to remote work influence the multifamily housing market? And do you think these trends will persist even after the pandemic? I mean, it's been almost a year or more than, we unofficially won the war against COVID-19.
Yeah, I think it does affect the rental housing market in a couple of different ways. One is that it really does affect the choice that people make between renting an apartment versus renting a single family, built to rent house in a community, in a built to rent community. It does affect the way we design properties for those people. But it also, during the pandemic, what we saw was that, as I said before, a lot of people moved away from very high cost places like San Francisco and New York to lower cost places in the Southeast. And the employers in some cases want them to move back to those high cost places. They're not going to get them. Instead, other employers are saying, well, we want those employees. They've moved to Charlotte. We need to move to Charlotte because we're now going to make it possible for them to work in the office in a place where they want to live. And that's not New York and it's not San Francisco. So now, having said that, I do think that the work from home movement, like most movements, went too far. And eventually we will get used to work from home, and we'll work out how to make it an effective solution for both employers and employees. I'll tell you a story. My wife works for an organization with two groups of work from home employees. One group does work that can very easily be evaluated, both in terms of how much they get accomplished and how well they do it. The other group does work that is much harder to evaluate, both in terms of how much they do and how well they do it. And what the organization found was that the first group, work from home, worked great. The second group was abusing it because they figured they wouldn't get caught if they slacked off, and in some cases even took a vacation while they said they were working. And so employers need to figure out, do we have the capability to evaluate the quality and the quantity of the work that our employees are doing from home? When they can do that, then of course they're going to want to allow people to continue working from home. When they cannot evaluate quantity or quality or both adequately, then they're going to want those employees back in the office. And it's going to happen because otherwise they risk having their employees abuse the work from home arrangement.
Absolutely, and unfortunately, there are lots of them who abuse it. But hopefully, my managers won't listen to this episode of podcast. But in my opinion, as long as you do your job right, and as long as you are being productive, it shouldn't really matter whether you work from home or office, as long as you're productive. Now, if you cannot be a pilot and then work from home, of course not.
No, for me, it really matters that I'm in the office. In fact, one of the reasons I chose my current job is because my employer wants people to be working together. I'm not at the stage of my life where I need a mentor. I'm the one being a mentor. But for a lot of people early in their career, they really do need to see people face to face every day so they can understand what it means to be a professional, and so that they can develop those relationships that help them make a path forward in their own career.
I absolutely agree with you. So let's pivot to the investment scene now briefly. So where do you think the hottest opportunities are for folks looking to invest in multifamily real estate right now? I mean, do you have any specific market or types of properties you're really excited about?
Well, the build to rent market is sort of the type of property, and as I said before, that means a professionally, a community that's designed for people to rent houses with four walls and their own lawn. It's not. I do not think that investing in scattered site single family rental is the future. I do not think that investing in rental houses that were originally built to be sold is a very well thought out strategy. I think it's, you have to do the market research to figure out what it is that people who want to rent a house want along with the house. But in terms of markets, yeah, I think it's very important to be considering some of those secondary markets in a very strongly growing, sort of economically vigorous city. It doesn't have to be a big city, but it should be a place with solid growth prospects. A place like, for example, Wilmington, North Carolina, or I mentioned before, places that are, maybe not, large cities like Orlando and Tampa, but also middle-sized cities like a Jacksonville, or Durham, North Carolina, very, very solid growth market, which I treat separately from Raleigh, even though a lot of people think of that as one metropolitan area. So when I look at the build to rent single family rental communities in a place with strong growth prospects, there are a bunch of those that I think are very, very good investment prospects.
So, in your opinion, what are some of the most important metrics investors should be looking at when evaluating multifamily properties?
So the real, honestly, the most important metrics have to do with the developer, the sponsor of the investment, because, as I said, there are a lot of people who got into the market because it looked like a really easy market to get into, and they decided to take on a lot of risk because the risk was essentially free. The interest rates were so low. So you have to look at your sponsor and say, all right, number one, do they have the analytical capabilities to evaluate where the growth prospects are on the demand side and on the supply side? I'll tell you the dirty little secret of real estate. Most of the intelligence that real estate developers come up with comes from nothing more than getting together with other real estate developers and having cocktail party conversation. When I first came to this company, there was a lot of interest in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, I have no reason to badmouth Chattanooga, Tennessee. I don't see the growth prospects there. And so when people started saying, oh, Chattanooga, I kept on saying, what do you think is happening in Chattanooga that makes it so exciting to you? What people eventually told me was, it's a great place to spend a weekend. All right, that's great. That's wonderful. I look forward to going to Chattanooga. But you don't build a multifamily housing development or a build-to-rent single-family rental development in a place that's a nice place to spend a weekend. You build it in a place where employers want to be there, and they want to be hiring people. And also, when you're getting together with other people who are building rental housing in the Southeast, a lot of them are focused on retirees. So again, people in my company were very excited about Daytona Beach, Florida. I get it. If we focused on retirees, I'd be very interested in Daytona Beach. We don't, and I'm not. So you have to, you look at your sponsor and say, do they have the analytical capabilities to figure out the best places to build, or are they just picking up the cocktail party conversation from the other developers? And then you look at, then another thing to look at is after they've gotten the financing, they've started construction. If a wrinkle comes up in the financing, are they able to deal with it? Or are they suddenly flailing around, taking a terrible financing deal that destroys their investors' returns just because it prevents them from losing what they've already done? You need a sponsor who has the capabilities to finish the project that they've started, and that's both on the financing side and on the construction side. So if people think of themselves as developers but don't do their own construction, they're at a big risk that other companies are not at, because other companies who have the construction capabilities too and the management capabilities can get the project finished and leased up.
Brad, as we come to a close, what essential insight or piece of advice would you offer to our listeners, particularly those engaged in data analytics or the economic aspects of the business?
I'll tell you that the most important advice that I always have is be skeptical, because there are so many stories that are told, and this is not just about rental housing. This is about macroeconomics as well. There are so many stories told that sound like they make perfect sense. But if you're skeptical, then you say to yourself, let me test that. Let me see whether that story really stands up to scrutiny. Not just is there some piece of evidence supporting it, but can I find other evidence that refutes it? And look for those pieces of evidence that refute the story, because it's so much easier to come up with a story than to do the work of actually collecting and analyzing data properly to figure out whether that story that you've heard is the right story, or whether it's just somebody spouting off who doesn't really know what they're talking about, even if they're called an economist. So that's my biggest piece of advice, and it absolutely holds true in rental housing or every other real estate investment or any other investment. Be skeptical of the stories that you're hearing.
Brad, thank you for your time and everything that you do to educate and inform others about our industry. I know it's not easy, but it is something that you must keep doing. And this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, it's very enjoyable for me. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Multifamily Talks, a RealPage podcast. As always, the views expressed are those of the individuals participating and not those of RealPage.